Missouri, 1855. Inside a small log cabin, the fire in the hearth was fading to embers. Outside, rain tapped softly against the wooden walls. Inside, a slave girl, not yet 20, sat in silence. Her name was Celia, simple, fragile, and treated as property, not person. She trembled between instinct to live and the shadow of power. When her master stepped into that room, the night became something else, not ordinary, but a verdict for the one driven to the edge. Celia's story began not in freedom, but in chains. Born into slavery in the early 1842nd, she was thrust into a world where her body was never her own, and her future was decided before she could even speak her name. To the white men and women who claimed ownership, she was not a daughter or a child. She was a piece of property, recorded on an inventory list alongside tools, livestock, and household furniture. The cabins where she grew up were not homes, but shelters of survival. Mud floors, rough timber walls, and a faint glow of embers were the only warmth slaves knew after exhausting days in the fields. For Celia, childhood was marked by the sound of a whip cracking in the distance, by the sharp orders barked at her mother, and by the unspoken knowledge that their lives were not theirs to shape. She belonged to someone else. While the big house stood with polished windows and glowing lamps, the slave quarters barely held together against the rain. Yet it was there that Celia absorbed fragments of humanity, songs whispered in the night, laughter quickly silenced, and stories of a freedom she could not imagine. She learned early that survival meant silence, obedience, and hiding the fire that smoldered within her. Celia's mother and the other women taught her skills needed for servitude, cooking, washing, and tending to children who were not her own. But these lessons carried a bitter truth. Each skill was not a path to independence, but a reinforcement of bondage. She was trained not for herself, but for those who owned her. By the time Celia was a teenager, she had already seen how slavery crushed lives, especially the lives of women. Young girls were forced into labor too soon. Mothers had their children sold away, sometimes never to be seen again. And at night, when the cabins grew still, the threat of men approaching their masters, overseers, or even visiting whites was a fear every enslaved woman carried. In this bleak world, Celia's quiet demeanor hid something deeper. Beneath her silence, she carried an unyielding hunger, the need to be recognized not as a slave, but as a human being. She was still only a girl, but life had already written cruelty across her skin and heart. When she was 14, Robert Newsom, a wealthy Missouri farmer, purchased her. To him, she was not a child stepping into womanhood. She was a possession, bought to serve both his household and his desires. With that transaction, Celia's life changed forever. Childhood ended abruptly. From that moment, she was no longer just a servant. She was forced into a role she never chose, one that would eventually lead her to the unthinkable act history remembers her for. From the very moment she entered Robert Newsom's household, Celia's body was claimed as his. At just 14 years old, she became the target of his violence, his control, and his lust. Each night that he forced his way into her cabin, Celia was reminded that in Missouri law, a slave girl had no right to refuse, no right to resist, and no right to defend herself. Her body had been turned into a prison. There were no courts to hear her cries, no neighbors who would intervene. The law was written to protect men like Newsom, not the girls they abused. For Celia, every breath became a negotiation with despair. She bore pregnancies forced upon her, only to lose children before she could even claim them as her own. Each loss hollowed her further, leaving her heart scarred with grief that no one outside the slave quarters acknowledged. The men who passed through the plantation saw her only as part of the estate, an asset that cooked meals, cleaned clothes, and satisfied her owner. Even among the enslaved community, shame and silence wrapped around her suffering. For women like Celia, the chains were not only iron shackles but also invisible bonds of violation, repeated until they blurred into routine. Yet in the midst of this torment, a dangerous clarity began to form. She realized that survival could not simply mean enduring. To live as she had been forced to live was not living at all. Her suffering was not private, it was a reflection of the countless women around her, each carrying wounds no one dared to name. Celia's body might have been owned, but her will had not yet been extinguished. By her late teens, she had endured nearly 5 years of assault at Newsom's hands. Each attack was both physical and symbolic, a reminder that she was never allowed to say no. but the very denial of that word sparked something radical inside her. If the law refused to grant her humanity, then she would have to claim it for herself. Every day, as she cooked for Newsom's family or laundered clothes under the hot Missouri sun, she carried this truth. Her life would only change if she forced it to. No one would rescue her. No one would intervene. And so she began to imagine an end, not of her suffering, but of the man who caused it. The decision was not made overnight. It was born from years of humiliation, loss, and the crushing certainty that she would never escape alive unless she acted. When Celia finally chose to fight back, it was not simply revenge. It was the desperate assertion of a truth stolen from her since birth. She was not property, not a body for use, but a person with the right to survive. In the weeks before that fateful night, Celia lived in two worlds. By day, she appeared as every other enslaved woman did, cooking meals, tending fires, washing clothes, and carrying out endless tasks that blurred one into another. She spoke little, never drew attention to herself, and kept her eyes lowered when whites passed. To outsiders, she was invisible, a shadow in the background of the Newsom household. But beneath this quiet exterior, something was building. Each chore, each silent hour, became a thread woven into a decision she could no longer avoid. When she stirred a pot over the fire, her hands imagined the weight of something heavier, something that could defend her. When she swept ashes from the hearth, she saw in them the traces of her own fading youth, stolen and scattered by a man who claimed her. Celia began to notice the patterns of Robert Newsom's movements. She knew the sound of his boots on the porch, the time of day he lingered too long by her cabin, the way his shadow stretched before him when the sun was setting. Each detail became a calculation in her mind. She did not know when she would act, but she knew that if she was to survive, the moment would come. At night, while others in the quarters slept, Celia sat by the fire in her cabin. The flames burned low, their glow flickering across her face as she stared into them like a clock ticking down her fate. Silence pressed in, broken only by the hiss of rain on the roof or the cry of a whippoorwill outside. She clutched tools, hefted small logs, and rehearsed the idea of resistance. To act would mean risking everything. To do nothing would mean surrendering the rest of her life. In the isolation of those nights, Celia discovered the sharp edge of her own will. She realized that fear no longer protected her, it only trapped her deeper. What she planned was dangerous, almost unthinkable for a slave girl. But the more she imagined it, the more inevitable it felt. The law had no mercy for her. The world had no place for her suffering. Only her own hands could decide her fate. Thus, in silence, Celia began to prepare, not with words or open defiance, but with the quiet, deliberate shaping of courage. Every passing day drew her closer to the night when silence would turn to action. Robert Newsom was, by all outward appearances, a respectable man in Callaway County, Missouri, a widowed farmer, a church-going neighbor, a father who spoke the language of law and order. To the community, he represented stability, Christian values, and the model of a landowner who had built his fortune through work and discipline. But behind that mask was something far darker. Like many white men of his time, Newsom saw enslaved women not as daughters of humanity but as extensions of his property. The law and society gave him silent permission to claim their bodies whenever he pleased. He cloaked his predation in the authority of a master, treating Celia's youth not as something to protect, but as something to exploit. To enslaved women, men like Newsom were the most dangerous. They carried both legal power and physical dominance, backed by a society that would never question them. They preached piety in church pews while violating the very children who served their tables. They called themselves fathers of families, while tearing apart the lives of enslaved families with the sale of husbands, wives, and children. For Celia, Newsom was not simply a cruel master, he was a living contradiction, a man who presented himself as righteous while embodying the corruption of slavery's core. Each time he forced his way into her cabin, he reinforced not just her suffering, but the larger truth that slavery thrived on the silent destruction of women's bodies. The community around him turned away. Neighbors may have whispered, but no one intervened. Ministers may have preached, but none condemned him. His daughters lived under his roof, yet none could or would protect Celia from the man they called father. In this way, Newsom became more than just one man in Celia's story. He became a symbol of the system itself, a system where men's respectability masked their crimes, where violence was normalized, and where justice was never meant for those held in bondage. To understand Celia's act is to understand the shadow of Newsom's presence. He represented the weight of an institution that claimed the right to her body, her choices, her very breath. When she finally raised her hand against him, it was not against one man alone. It was against the embodiment of every crime committed in the name of slavery. The night of the 23rd of June, 1855, was heavy with summer heat. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and damp, and inside Celia's cabin the fire had sunk to faint embers. She sat waiting, heart pounding in rhythm with the silence. She knew the sound of his footsteps, Robert Newsom approaching as he had so many times before. But tonight, she was not the same. Tonight, her silence was sharpened into resolve. When Newsom entered the cabin, there was no greeting, no hesitation. He carried with him the casual authority of a man convinced of his ownership, a man who had forced himself on her for nearly 5 years. He expected obedience. He expected her to submit. But Celia had prepared. In the corner rested a heavy stick of wood, a weapon born of desperation. As he reached for her, she grasped it with both hands. The weight was strange, terrifying, but it was also the only thing between her life and the endless nights of violation. The first blow came suddenly, with the force of years of rage and grief compressed into a single motion. The sound of it split the silence. Newsom staggered, stunned, unable to believe the defiance of a girl he had long considered powerless. She struck again, harder, fueled not by revenge alone, but by the instinct to survive. In those moments, the world seemed to hold its breath. The cabin was dark, except for the faint glow of coals, shadows flickering against rough wooden walls. Outside, the night stretched endless and indifferent. Inside, a 19-year-old girl chose to live, even if it meant ending the life of the man who owned her. When it was over, Celia stood trembling, the stick slipping from her hands. Her chest rose and fell in gasps. There was no triumph, no relief, only shock at what had been done, and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. The act that had freed her for a moment would condemn her forever. Celia's choice did not end with that night. It began a chain of consequences she could not escape. At first, she tried to hide what had happened. Fear guided her hands as she attempted to conceal the truth, believing for a brief moment that silence might protect her. But silence, like smoke, could not be contained. Whispers spread quickly across the plantation. Neighbors noticed Newsom's absence. His daughters began to ask questions, and suspicion grew heavier with each passing day. Celia was brought before local authorities, interrogated by men who never once considered her suffering. To them, the question was not why she acted, but how she dared. Under questioning, she faltered between truth and silence. To admit what she had done was to condemn herself. To remain silent was to die in another way, buried under lies and shame. Each word she spoke was twisted, each attempt to explain drowned by the presumption that a slave could never have the right to resist her master. The community's response was swift. Newsom's death was not seen as the consequence of his crimes, but as an affront to the social order. A slave girl had killed a white man. Worse, she had defied the system that rested on obedience and submission. Her act was not judged as self-defense. It was framed as rebellion, and rebellion had only one outcome. Other enslaved people watched in silence, terror pressing on their throats. They understood what Celia had done, even if they could not say it aloud. For them, her act was both a spark of courage and a warning of the price it carried. For Celia, the days that followed were a blur of confinement, questioning, and the slow tightening of fate. She had seized one moment of freedom, but in the eyes of the law, she had committed the greatest crime a slave could commit. She had defended herself. The system demanded she pay for that act, not with silence, but with her life. Celia's trial began in October 1855, in a courthouse filled with men who had already decided her fate. The walls carried the weight of expectation. This was not about justice for a young enslaved woman, but about reasserting control after one dared to resist. The central question was framed coldly. Did Celia, as a slave, have the right to defend herself against her master's sexual demands? The answer, in the eyes of the court, was never in doubt. Her defense attorneys, white men assigned to represent her, attempted to argue self-defense. They pointed to Missouri law that protected women from assault, suggesting that even an enslaved woman should be shielded under its provisions. It was a fragile hope, one that pushed against the very structure of slavery. But the prosecution was relentless. To acknowledge Celia's right to resist would unravel the foundation of a system that depended on total obedience. Witnesses were called, testimonies gathered. The voices of white neighbors, Newsom's own daughters, and local authorities painted Celia not as a victim but as a murderer. Inside the courtroom, Celia sat quietly, her eyes lowered, her presence both central and erased. She was there, yet her voice was silenced by the very framework of the law. No one asked what she had endured since the age of 14. No one cared about the nights stolen from her or the children she lost. Instead, the trial became a performance, a ritual in which the community reaffirmed its power over her. The jury, all white men, deliberated briefly. Their verdict was swift, guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced her to hang. The ruling was not just against Celia, it was a declaration to every enslaved person in Missouri and beyond. You have no right to your body, no right to resist, no right to be human. Yet the trial left echoes. In the slave quarters, the story spread. Celia had struck back, and for that, she was condemned. In whispers, her act became larger than the courtroom's judgment. For the enslaved, her defiance was not erased, it was remembered, even as the law sought to bury it. The 21st of December, 1855. The winter air in Missouri was sharp, the sky heavy with gray clouds. Celia, not yet 20 years old, was led to the place of execution. Chains clinked against her wrists and ankles, a cruel echo of the life she had known since birth. There were no mourners gathered in her defense, no public voice to cry out for mercy. The community that had judged her saw only a slave girl who had broken the unspoken code, obedience unto death. To them, she was a warning, not a victim. As she stood before the gallows, her body thin, her face marked by exhaustion, she carried herself with a quiet dignity. If she was afraid, she did not show it. If she grieved, it was for the life stolen from her long before this day. The rope hung like a sentence carved into the air. The executioners did their work quickly. No sermon of compassion was read, no recognition of the years of torment that led her here. In the records, her name was listed beside the crime, reduced to a statistic in the ledger of Missouri justice. But for those who stood at a distance, enslaved men and women who dared to watch Celia's death, was not the end. They carried her story back to their cabins, whispering it in the glow of firelight, passing her name from mouth to mouth. In their eyes, Celia did not die as a criminal. She died as a girl who had claimed one moment of freedom in a world that denied her everything. The law could erase her from the page, but memory would not let her go. Her silence at the gallows was louder than any scream. It was the silence of centuries of women forced into submission, of mothers who had no protection, of daughters taken too soon. On that December day, Celia's body fell, but her defiance remained haunting the conscience of a nation that refused to see her as human. After Celia's execution, the silence across Callaway County was telling. There was no public outrage, no sympathy in newspapers for a 19-year-old girl who had been forced into submission since childhood. The official record simply noted the crime, the trial, and the punishment. Her story, to those in power, was closed. But within the slave quarters, her name carried weight. Around evening fires, women whispered her story as both a warning and a prayer. Children listened with wide eyes as their mothers spoke of Celia, the girl who dared to strike back, even when the world said she had no right. To them, she was not simply a victim. She was a symbol, fragile yet unbreakable, a reminder that resistance was possible, even if it came at the ultimate cost. Slaveholders, however, responded differently. Celia's act of defiance struck fear into their hearts. If one young enslaved woman could rise against her master, what might others do? Laws and restrictions tightened. Patrols grew harsher. The violence of the system became more rigid, as though chains could silence the memory of her courage. Yet, repression could not erase the echo of her name. Every time a woman was forced into silence, Celia's story lingered in the shadows, whispering that the silence might one day break. Every time an enslaved man was whipped into submission, he remembered that even the weakest could strike when pushed to the edge. Her story did not remain confined to Missouri. In abolitionist circles, fragments of her trial and execution spread, carried by those who recognized its significance. To the north, Celia's fate was proof of slavery's deepest corruption, that even the law would not protect a girl from the violence of her master. To the south, her name was an unspoken reminder of what lay beneath the surface, the simmering rage of the enslaved. For years, her name was spoken quietly, half in fear, half in reverence. And though history books ignored her, her memory lived where history seldom looked in the songs, the whispers, the prayers of those who carried on. Celia's silence became heavier than any whip's crack, a silence that reminded both oppressors and oppressed of the cost of bondage. Celia's life ended before it truly began, yet her story endures as a question history cannot silence. Does a slave girl have the right to say no? Missouri's court answered no, but her act said otherwise. She was only 19, a girl stripped of choice, yet in a single desperate night, she claimed her humanity in the only way she could. Her defiance was punished with death, but it also revealed the cruelty at the heart of slavery, its theft not only of labor, but of body and soul. History forgot her name in official records, yet memory kept her alive, in whispers by firelight, in abolitionist arguments, and in the conscience of generations. Celia remains. Her silence on the gallows spoke louder than screams. It told of every enslaved woman denied the right to resist, every daughter forced into submission, every life erased. In that silence lies her legacy, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of courage in the darkest of nights. Celia reminds us that even the most silenced voice can carry across centuries. She was not property, she was not a crime, she was a person who chose to resist, and that choice echoes still.